Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Our guest on this episode is Slater Viktorov, founder and CTO of Indico. Today, we'll be talking about complex document processing with Slater using intelligent automation. And I'm actually very much looking forward to this conversation. So welcome, Slater.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. I'm also really excited to talk about this.
Awesome. Very good. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your background, because we got to understand about you.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, I'm the founder and CTO of Indico. That's my primary job. I'm also an executive in residence at 406 Ventures. I was recently named at Forbes 30 Under 30. So I am young and busy, I guess, is what I'm principally trying to communicate. But the really core thing that brought me to Indico, and the question of who I am, what do I love, what is the lens that I'm going to bring to this problem, was, I think, really well summed up in something that I said to one of my professors in 2012. It was, "The war is over, deep learning lost." And I now characterize that quote as the most wrong I've ever been. And at the same time, even though I didn't know it at the time, that was the start of Indico. So I would say really the way that we came to this technology that ended up being so incredibly effective in the enterprise, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, was really recognizing that while deep learning was really incredibly effective, specifically for perceptual tasks where you've got language and vision information, in this case, it was very impractical to use in the enterprise. Both the question of how you actually train these with reasonable amount of data, how you scale this up, how you make it robust and explainable, all of these problems that were very much unsolved in the early days. And that's really what we focused on. Is how do we help people make use of this really bleeding edge technology to solve a really.
So it's not all about the technology. Technology is what...
Yeah, but I am the CTO.
Exactly. No, I totally understand your perspective on it. But as we look at this, your technology and the concepts behind deep learning really led into more this intelligent document processing concept. And this goes back for almost a decade since you've been doing this. And you say you're young, but the fact is you've been doing this for quite some time. How did you start translating some of that technology more into this focus towards some interpretation on documentation or documents?
Yeah, so I think there was a particular flashpoint moment for us where very early incarnation of Indico, we were, to your point, I think so focused on technology, overly focused on technology. We were a series of developer APIs, and while they were very usable and we created, I think, a really high quality product there, the business model was something we really couldn't figure out at that time. It was just way, way too early in the market for a developer product for that kind of technology to really work. So we actually had to take a step back and figure out, okay, what have we done? We've had all of this really awesome technology lying around, and we ended up getting a call from John Hancock Manulife. And we did a press release several years ago now about this, but it's all public information. And they really clued us into this idea that the technology that we had built, specifically this transfer learning that allows you to train these very high quality deep learning models, very small amounts of data, was incredibly valuable. And eventually through a series of experiments, we ended up finding that document processing was just a field that we could totally revolutionize and in fact go after this unstructured data space broadly, using these tools that allow you to do things simply that would have been prohibitively expensive or difficult.
That makes a lot of sense. The technology there is there, the focus on document processing is there. You're someone who's also really in tune with RPA and intelligent automation. So as we look at the various workflows that exist in nearly every organization, there's quite a lot of non-digitized data that it makes a challenge for building automations. So let's start with an obvious question, which is, why do you think there's paper or non-digitized forms when there's so many other potential solutions to collect and manage that kind of data?
I think part of the reason is that these are historic processes, right? I think that's definitely something that can't be overlooked, is when something has been around for 30, 40 years and there's a lot of inconsistency in it, there is a lot of inertia to changing things. But I think that actually plays a smaller role than people believe. I think people believe most of that is inertia. I think actually the crux of it is this question, what is a document? And we got asked this question all the time, because I think in a lot of cases, if you think about invoice or receipt or something, it might not be obvious to you what is different between a document and a web form, right? Why can't we just get everything in this beautiful structured format right from the get-go? And the reason is because there's actually a lot of ambiguity in those documents. Even when you think about something that's incredibly kind of commoditized, certainly in today's document processing market, like invoice processing, it turns out that everyone actually has a slightly, but importantly different concept of what information you should pull out of an invoice. And I think that's actually a really important point, because as difficult as that is for invoice, it's 10 times more difficult if you start to think about mortgage applications, right? Appraisals for houses. And I think that's a lot of the reason why, is because they really focus on getting all the information in one place in a way that a human can read it. And it's actually really profoundly difficult and context dependent when you think about what is it going to take to turn this into a structured payload for whatever downstream process is relevant.
So you mentioned one of those things, the invoice processing. That is the poster child for RPA. And every business has to do this. It's a repetitive task. Every business has the finance type function, and invoice processing certainly is one of those pieces that people are like, oh my gosh, how can we do this? How can we do this better? How does intelligent document processing address the issues that you just brought up in terms of the context and the information, and certainly removing some of the ambiguity? Because you look at any of these companies, I think of some forms I've seen in the past where a real estate company would be getting in all of these invoices from the various landscape maintenance firms that they got. And you have 50 properties, you have 50, 60, 70 of these folks sending you these invoices, and none of them are the same. And that's just
and that's actually a pretty easy situation. 50, 60,
right.
70, right?
That's what I'm saying. This is a small example. I'm saying it, but it is an example. Now you scale that up to some of these very large organizations where there's massive numbers of invoices. How do you approach that?
Yeah. So this is actually, you really cut down to the core of it, because I think this explains why deep learning is so different from the more traditional techniques you use in this space. Because traditionally, you'd make these really reified templates that are made for a very specific invoice and say, okay, if I get something in exactly this format, I know how to process it. It's a reasonable solution for a certain class of problems. And I think the reason that invoices have become this poster child is because you can actually demo invoices really well with old school template technology. But it still remains this really big, unsolved, latent pain point almost for customers, despite the fact that everyone and their grandmother now has invoices, because of this actual total cost of ownership and long tail data. And this is actually where deep learning is really fundamentally different. Because when you think about something traditional and you've got an invoice that comes in, you're like, okay, this invoice is a template, and either I know this template or I don't, right? Very binary outcome. In this new domain, right, you actually are digitizing the documents in a kind of native way inside the application. So that's first, because these are not native things coming in. This is like facts of a scan of an email, right? So the first thing that you have to do is have a really good OCR layer in. And for a lot of the technology that we use, we're using third parties or open source technology where it's effective. There are some places where we had to build our own, but we generally believe in buying wherever it makes sense and kind of OEMing into that into our solution to make it really easy for customers. But the digitization is really important. We actually support both OmniPage and Read API, which is a slightly higher quality OCR engine, a little bit more computationally expensive as well. But then the idea is, once you've got it into that format, actually a huge part of the process is just getting everyone on the same page about what information you want to take out and how you're going to get it into a really consistent. Because the existing process is probably very robust to those kinds of human variations. The amount of human noise you've got in the process is probably designed in such a way that it's all right and you don't end up calling attention to that. But the second you start automating it, right, the second you start putting an intelligent agent into that, trying to take over some of that workload, you really have to have a well-defined, consistent view of the problem. And that actually, I would say, is where 80% of the difficulty is, getting that persistent problem.
All right. So there are so many different types of documents, but even invoices as a type of document have many variations. So then you add in related documents that may be part of a package, like in a mortgage application or an insurance claim. You might have data that's correlated between individual document types that needs to be understood as a whole. How can intelligent document processing work in an automated way to support those types of use cases?
So I think the key is really thinking about where you pass over to a tool that's really well suited some other aspect. My thesis here really broadly is that Actually, once you've got the data into a really good structured format, so in this case, for instance, and we actually deal with a lot of use cases that have this flavor, but say you've got court settlement, and maybe as a part of a court settlement, there are 8 different documents, and you need to check that the 50 different fields in these different documents all check out, and they're all consistent, and it's all written the same way. Or you might even have to do this very kind of complex relationships. Maybe I've got a monthly schedule in one, and I've got an annual schedule in the other, and I need to figure out that they actually line, which is a pretty common kind of operation. So the first step is really just figuring out, okay, how do we get all of the structured information out of this unstructured, usually scanned PDF type document in a way that downstream problem then becomes. And that actually, I think, is a really helpful formulation, because if you say, hey, we have to check to make sure all of these numbers line up, then you're like, okay, we've got to split this packet out. We probably need an extraction model for each one of these. We need to be extracting this collection of fields over here, this collection of fields over there. And that's all really a business requirements. But I think here's the place where a lot of people fall down, is that you're never going to get it right the first time. And in fact, what you really need to be able to do once you've got that initial definition in that spec is to be able to test it and iterate very quickly and cheap. We find it's not strange that it might take half a dozen times to get your problem formulation. And the key is really getting through those first half dozen trials as quickly as possible.
I see. Interesting. As you're looking at these relationships between documents and going to the understanding of the data, we start digging down deeper. Taking OCR, you can understand the characters. You get to NLP, you can understand some of the context pieces. As we start drilling down there, we start looking at like legal documents or leases, for example. Again, going back to our real estate example, companies that have thousands of leases that they have to manage or work through or validate.
Huge use case for us.
It is, I can imagine. So describe some of the successes you've seen inside these very complex document automation cases.
So I think that the biggest case, just to show something like leases, or even to make that a little bit more broad, if you think of all kinds of title and deed documents, to give a sense of that scale, you've got 3,000 counties in the United States. You've probably got a few dozen different variations, probably about 50 different document types of these various different documents that need to be filed with the state and with the county and with your local folks when you're doing a real estate. And so you take that kind of whole body of documents around that transfer of ownership, and you've got 150,000 document variations. By the way, each one of those probably turns into multiple templates, because, they might have some variations, multi-line versions, maybe there's a writer in some case, those lines. So you just very quickly get to the point where you're just never going to be able to solve this in a tractable way using traditional kind of template-based technology. But using this kind of deep learning-based technology, what you can do instead is set up this human-in-the-loop system where you say, hey, this is the consistent structure that we want out of these documents. And you might have to define it differently for some of those 50 document types. But actually, for a lot of them, it's going to be the same. And I'll tell you, we don't actually necessarily need a different model to handle every single different document type if you're trying to pull the same kind of information out of it, and if a person can process it in the same way. So I think that's a really big power. And that is true of Indico, but that's true generically of this deep learning technology, because it's got that very rich contextual representation. And in a case like that, where it would probably cost millions of dollars just in ongoing ownership to maintain 150,000 templates, not even talking about the data infrastructure you would need to use such a thing. If you could even make a template classification engine that would scale to 150,000 documents, I don't think anyone's actually solved any of those problems yet. But what you can do instead is just define, in our case, a couple hundred documents is really what you're talking about. They give a contextual sense. Hey, this is where to look for a total value. This is where to look for appraisal value. This is where to look for the buyer name and the seller name. This is kind of context that usually appears around it. And we rely really heavily on the subject matter expert, whoever is processing those documents today, to teach the machines. And we try to give them a very intuitive interface to do that. But really, they have to stay in control of the process, I think, from finding what is the correct consistent quantity. And we view very much sort of the AI assistance there as a tool for them to use to accelerate it.
So where do you see this IDP technology growing into over the next few years? I mean, what should we be expecting as you're seeing some of the models that you're creating and things that are evolving in the market space? Where do you see this going?
I think one of the big changes I've noticed, certainly over the last 6 months, and I think is only going to accelerate going forward, is people really recognizing the spectrum, not even just of all their document use cases, but even thinking more broadly about unstructured. Because it's a little hard to draw a line. Is pure text still a document? If I've got a home appraisal and I've got images in there for the different rooms of the house, then if I do image analysis on those, is that separate? It's a little hard to tease the pieces apart. But I think the really big opportunity is you start looking broadly at use cases that have that same flavor, right? That have that same shape really broadly of I'm taking unstructured data in, I'm classifying it, I'm trying to convert it into something structured. And I think that people are now starting to realize that they don't just have one or two use cases like this, because I think maybe the prior generation, you saw a couple of modestly successful point solutions where people started to realize they had problems. But people are now starting to realize that they don't have one or two, they don't have 5 or 10, they might have 100, 200 of these use cases within their organization. And when you've got something of that scale, you really need to start looking for something that's going to help you manage that entire body of use cases. You can't allow business units to necessarily do things totally autonomously here, just because the adoption of a lot of these AI intelligent automation solutions is very impactful. It can meaningfully change the way that a business operates. So I think that you're going to see a much bigger change towards that kind of mindset. You've already started to see it, but also Gartner has this idea of a multi-persona data science platform. That's something that I believe in very much. And the idea is that really, if you want to be successful in that role of helping people build the 100 use cases they've got to get after in their organization, you have to really be that area of collaboration. You have to be that connective tissue with the organization between the data science group and the SMEs and the management layer, and make sure that everyone wins in that exchange. So I think that's going to be a really big area. They just came out with a market guide for it. So I think we're going to see more and more progress into those science platforms.
So to follow on to that, how do you perceive that changing the way that business or organizations, I would say organizations, because I see a lot of benefit for government organizations in this case. How do you see them changing the way they operate based on these new technologies?
I think that there are a lot of implications. One that is not intuitive, but I think incredibly impactful, is the audit function, actually. And I think that I just bring this up because it's an example of how something like really banal and ordinary can actually have just incredible impact across the organization. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but if you look at a loan approval process, mortgage approval process, something along those lines, there's an audit process that you're going to have to go through at the end of the year. Now, most organizations, when you go through that packet of documents, they keep a very limited amount of information on hand about what actually happened. Information was extracted, why it was approved, rejected. You basically get the documents went to Stacy, and Stacy said they were good, so they got approved. So that means when it comes time for the audit at the end of the year, you have to redo everything from scratch. And you have no real trace of what happened. You have to re-justify from scratch that you've got this process. Now, imagine you're doing that all, and this is some of the benefits you start to see even with maybe simpler digital transformation efforts as well. But you start to imagine, hey, if I've got suddenly this chain of custody and I know not just that this was approved, but hey, these are the 50 fields that we extracted. This is the business logic we applied to them to determine whether it was approved or rejected. Stacy looked at fields 3 through 4, decided they were all right. There was an error on field 12 that she corrected, and you have the exact spans and where the document every value was. So you've got this trail that means suddenly, rather than spending $5 million every year, right, to audit this process, you can do this for low 6 figures. And I think it's just a good example of how little transparency there is in these processes today, how much better things could be tomorrow, and how it radically changes the efficiency with which a business can operate. These are massive fixed costs in some cases that allow them to get a tremendous efficiency leg up on the competition. In other cases, right, if you imagine the turnaround time, right, if you imagine the service that you can deliver to customers, these actually start to turn into real serious revenue driving improvements in business. I think those are just a couple of areas where you start to see really amazing things that intelligent automation can bring.
Last question. How does an organization get started doing this? The technology is there, but we all know, especially within a public setting, a public environment, they're not necessarily the first movers when it comes to technology. So how would you encourage perhaps public sector, or perhaps even just some of the more, say, established organizations who don't necessarily move as quickly as a startup, to be looking at this technology and adopting it in their business processes?
So I think The important thing is to walk before you run. I think that many people think that means you should do RPA first and do all of your RPA use cases and then go on to process mining and do all of your process mining use cases. I don't actually think that's quite right, because these technologies bolster each other well enough that you're actually better off having an immature RPA practice and an immature IPA practice and an immature process mining practice and having them all working together than having a really developed single one of those. So instead, I think that the right way for people to dip their toes is to get very concrete, very specific. And what I say specifically in the unstructured space, when you're talking about intelligent process automation, when you're talking about things like invoices and contracts, is start with the data. You might have no idea about what vendor you want, whether you want to do it even with a vendor or with your internal data science team. You might even not know whether you want to automate this year or in 5 years, but you will always be well served by gathering a few hundred pieces such that you really have a statistically representative set of your data, and try to get a consistent sense of what information you should be extracting. It's an incredibly informative experience for anyone. It's going to expose things that you didn't know about. And it serves this dual purpose of, if you can successfully figure that out, you're extremely well situated then to both vet vendors and execute on an IPA strategy.
That's fantastic. I appreciate you going through that. I'm so happy that you joined us today, because this was really interesting for me to listen through. And I imagine it's going to be very interesting for the folks who are listening, because this is important. These are things that how our businesses are changing, how the technology is allowing us to evolve, really not just to manage documents, but really manage the businesses differently, leveraging the data that's been stuck inside some of those documents and that unstructured information. So thank you for providing all of your insights today on intelligent document processing and how it could work with intelligent automation.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. It was a total pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel, where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.